We're back once again talking about the Seattle Kraken expansion draft coming up this summer and who the Kraken could be getting from the Montreal Canadiens. And no, this is not just going to be Jake Allen, the video. By the way, if you do find yourself enjoying this video at any point and you like to do that kind of thing, the subscribe button down there can probably help you out. The Canadiens have had a bit of an interesting 2021 season, but a successful one to this point anyway. They got off to a very hot start and then slumped just enough to get head coach Claude Julien fired. But now they've bounced back and look poised to claim the third spot in the Canadian division coming into the playoffs. Now, of course, most of the hockey world and media wants to see them play Toronto in the playoffs, but as things stand right now, they'd have to get through McDavid, Draisaitl, and the Oilers in order to do so. And of course, Toronto would actually have to get out of the first round of the playoffs for once, but that's a whole different thing. But as always for Seattle, they don't really care how well the Canadiens play or how far they go in the playoffs. All they really care about is who they can end up taking from this team after the playoffs are done. But first, of course, the Canadiens do get to protect some players, and as is the case with most of the teams, I do think it's most likely they'll probably end up going the 7-3-1 protection route. Starting on the forward end, where Brendan Gallagher has a no movement clause, so he has to be protected, but even without it, he probably would be anyway. And then Jesperi Kotkaniemi and Tyler Toffoli are also pretty much locks at this point. And then filling out the rest of the protection list on the forward end, I have Josh Anderson, who also I think is pretty much a lock at this point, Tomas Tatar, Jonathan Drouin, and Philip Deneau. Now yes, at least at the point at which I'm making this video, both Tatar and Deneau have yet to sign contracts for 2022. But as things stand right now, the Canadiens only have 6 draft eligible forwards with contracts that go through 2022 at the very least. So if they did want to leave those guys as UFAs and try to sign them after the expansion draft, then they would still have to sign a couple of other guys in order to meet the exposure requirements. So with both of those guys, and especially Tatar, as well as Kotkaniemi, who doesn't have a contract for next year either, I think it's fairly safe to say that they probably will be protected whether or not they've actually signed at the point the expansion draft rolls around. And then of course there's the unknown of Drouin and the situation that has him taking an indefinite leave of absence from the team, who wouldn't go into details but did put him on long-term injury reserve and did say that he had the support of both the team and his teammates. So taking that into consideration, even with him just having 2 goals but still 23 points in the 44 games he played this season, I went ahead and protected him anyway. So then moving over to the defensive end, Jeff Petrie has a no movement clause here, so again he would have to be protected, but again I think he probably would be with or without it. And then those other 2 protection slots, at least right now, I think go to Joel Edmondson and Shea Weber. But even with that said, and Weber being the Canadiens' second best defenseman this year, with him also being 35 and still having 5 years left on his contract that sees him earning $8 million per year, and keeping in mind the flat cap, I do think there's still room for another guy to potentially earn his way onto this protection list and take Weber's spot with a standout performance in the playoffs. But for now, I think it's a little bit more likely that Weber probably does end up getting that spot. And that just leaves us with the protected goaltender, where again we have a no movement clause with Carey Price, which means he would have to be protected if he doesn't want to waive it. Now, I don't by any means think it's super likely to happen, but I could see a situation in which Montreal asks Price to waive his no movement clause in order to protect Allen. But considering he's Carey Price, that would be pretty much asking him, hey, do you want to go play in Seattle next year? Because if exposed, Price would be a pretty easy pickup here for the Kraken. And I feel like he would probably know that, so I don't think it's terribly likely that whether asked or not, he isn't the protected goaltender. And before we get to Allen, let's talk about some of the other players that this could leave available for the Kraken to pick from. On the forward end, again, because of the lack of signed contracts the Canadiens have for next season, I do want to look at a couple of guys that are currently set to be UFAs next year, but if they find their way into contracts, could be interesting options for the Kraken to look at. Or maybe they just want to negotiate with somebody that is set to be UFA when the expansion draft rolls around. The most tempting such option, and probably the guy most likely to end up in Seattle from this team not named Jake Allen, would be Joel Armia. The soon-to-be 28-year-old 2011 16th overall pick has played in 332 games across 7 NHL seasons, where he has 125 points on 62 goals and 63 assists. really outside of a slow start in his first couple of seasons in Winnipeg, being right around a half a point per game type of player throughout the course of his career. And on top of that, since joining the Canadiens in 2018, over the last couple of seasons, he's added a pretty substantial physical element to his game as well, with well over 100 hits in each of his first 2 seasons in Montreal, as well as 81 hits so far in his 37 games this year. And whether it's because of that added physical aspect to his game, or just an overall pretty good hockey sense, he's also improved pretty noticeably in his possession stats over the last few seasons as well, where his Corsi for percentage has been 51 or better in each of the last 4 seasons, this season at currently 55%. Something that has also been reflected in his expected plus minus, where he's been positive in each of the last 4 seasons and noticeably positive in each of the last 3, bringing his career total up to 14.8. Now again, whether or not Armia ends up being tempting enough for the Kraken to pick probably depends fairly heavily on whether or not he ends up signing for next season before the expansion draft. And even if he does, there is also the chance that if, say, Danault doesn't sign for next season and Armia does, that he could end up taking that 7th slot on the protection list, and Danault without a contract could be off of it. But if both do sign, then I do think that Danault probably gets that spot, so either way, I don't think Danault with a contract extension will be available for the Kraken to pick. Another guy, though, who is probably in a similar boat as Armia as far as needing a contract extension before the expansion draft in order to be worth picking for the Kraken, would be Artturi Lehkonen. The winger, who will be turning 26 right around the time of the expansion draft, has had a career so far not too dissimilar from Armia. He's played in 334 games across 5 NHL seasons, where he has 116 points on 59 goals and 57 assists. So for him, a little bit closer to a point every 3 games rather than a point every other game, but again, fairly similar stats to what Armia has over the course of his career, especially if you were to take out this season, which has been a bit of a rough one for him, where he only has 9 points on 5 goals and 4 assists in 43 games. But like Armia as well, he has also added a much more physical aspect to his game over the last few seasons, with 120 hits in each of the 2 seasons leading into this one, and now 75 hits in 43 games so far this year. And once again, that has also helped him when it comes to his possession stats, where this currently is the first year that he would have a Corsi for percentage below 52, and each of the last 2 years has been above 53%. And then of course has never been negative when it comes to expected plus minus, with a career total of 22.6 in his 5 seasons. But with all that having been said, even though this season having been his worst in his NHL career up to this point anyway, would probably mean that he ends up exposed rather than being on the protection list like it looked like he could have been coming into the season. That, in combination with the fact that he is set to be an RFA at the end of the year rather than a UFA, probably means that Montreal doesn't have too terribly much as far as incentive is concerned to extend him before the expansion draft. And without an extension before then, I just don't know that he's probably someone that Kraken will look too heavily at. There is one guy on the forward end, though, who does already have a contract for next season, probably will be unprotected, and might be worth taking a look at for the Kraken, and that is Jake Evans. With that having been said, though, Evans would be a bit of a reach of a pick. He is a little bit more on the younger end compared to some of the other guys who are potentials on the forward end, with him just about to turn 25 years old, but currently he doesn't have that much NHL experience with just 56 games played across the last 2 seasons, and in those games just has 13 points. The vast majority of that coming this year, where he has just 10 points on 2 goals and 8 assists in 43 games. Now, granted, he has been stuck on the 4th line pretty much the entirety of the season, so he hasn't gotten all that much ice time, but still 10 points in 43 games is hardly coming out of the gates running. But at least at the AHL level, where he spent the majority of his time over the last couple of seasons leading into this one, he was a much more consistent points producer there, scoring a point in roughly 2 out of every 3 games. So the potential is still possibly there that he could turn into a decent forward down the road. But another thing that probably hurts his chances of being the selection for the Kraken is the fact that if Seattle did want to go the route of maybe picking a younger player who has yet to prove himself at the NHL level, more of the prospect pick, then their best option probably comes from the defensive end in Kale Flurry. The 22-year-old right-shotted defenseman is not by any means a point scorer, which is evidenced by his 1 point on 1 goal in 41 games in his rookie season this year. But what he lacks in points production, which would keep him out of a top pair or probably even top 4 type of defensive role, he makes up for by making his presence well known on the ice. With currently more than a block shot per game with 45 and 41 games, and over 100 hits already this season, with 102 in the 41 games this season. And with only 6 penalty minutes in 41 games, it's not like he's a young Tom Wilson out there constantly putting his team of player down. He's picking his shots well and taking them. Of course, he is a defenseman and doesn't score points, so there's not a lot of reason to compare him to Wilson, but again, that's not the point. The point is that he's a pretty young player that's finding ways to contribute at the NHL level, which is always a good thing. He too, though, is also set to be an RFA at the end of the season, so he probably would need an extension before the expansion draft in order to be a terribly tempting option. On the defensive end too, though, there is one player who does already have a contract for next season and could be a tempting option for the Kraken to pick, and that is Ben Chiarot, the left-shot defenseman who will be turning the big 3-0 here in the next couple of days. So if you are watching this, which obviously you are, happy birthday Ben, has played in 411 career games across 8 NHL seasons, mostly for the Winnipeg Jets. In that time, he has 91 points on 22 goals and 69 assists, which points production-wise is obviously nothing spectacular, but it's okay for a second or third paired defenseman, which he's been for the majority of his career. Where he's made his money, though, is getting in the way of shots and throwing his body around, with 648 career block shots, with well over 100 in each of the last 2 seasons leading into this one, as well as 779 hits over the course of his career, again well over 100, even over 150 in each of the last 2 years leading into 2021. And when it comes to his possession stats, although he wouldn't seem to be anything other than perfectly average with a career Corsi for percentage of 50.3 and a career expected plus minus of 6.2, over the last 2 years since joining the Canadiens, he's had a 53.3 Corsi for percentage and a 15.3 expected plus minus, which is a noticeable uptick from what he was doing in Winnipeg. So really, as things stand right now, without much changing on the forward end with contracts for guys like Armia or Lehkonen, one of the biggest arguments against taking Chiarot would just be that there are going to be a lot of good defensemen available for the Kraken to select in the expansion draft. But something to consider there is that defensemen, especially ones like Chiarot who only have 1 year left on a decent contract, could serve as pretty tempting trade chips down the road, so the Kraken could go the route of loading up on defensemen and then trading them for other assets after the expansion draft. Of course, though, the other big reason for not picking Chiarot would be Jake Allen. Allen is definitely the most popular pick that people have for who will end up on the Kraken when it comes to Montreal. Now, to be fair, part of that is the fact that the choice of who they want to protect is pretty much out of the Canadiens' hands with the no movement clause on Carey Price. But again, it's Carey Price and they probably protect him with or without it, even if his prime is past him and he does still have a few years left on his contract. Meanwhile, Allen has played in 315 games across 8 NHL seasons, the first 7 of which being with the St. Louis Blues before coming to the Montreal Canadiens this year, serving most of his career as a backup goalie or platoon option in St. Louis, with a couple of years in the middle there where he did see the majority of the starting time before that Jordan Binnington Stanley Cup winning season in 2018-2019. Now, because of how sure a lot of people seem to be that Jake Allen will be the player ending up in Seattle from Montreal, you could be forgiven for thinking that he is some sort of really high-end goalie who's just living in the shadow of Carey Price in Montreal. But really, throughout the majority of his career, he's been right around a league average goalie, with a career save percentage of .912 and a career goals against of 2.52. And yes, both of those career stats are very much on the better end of league average, but they are also dragged up by a couple of noticeably better seasons he had, like last season where he had a .927 save percentage and a 2.15 goals against, as well as his 2015-16 season where in 47 games he had a .920 save percentage and a 2.35 goals against. But it is also in those career stats that you do find the strong point in his game, where he has been a pretty consistent goaltender throughout the course of his career. Plus, he is one of very few players who did find his way onto the all-rookie list in not 1, but 2 different seasons, also getting Calder votes in both the 2012-13 season and the 2014-15 season. I'll let you go ahead and figure out how he managed that one, but still. Plus, when it comes to another area where goalies in particular tend to be judged much more heavily in the playoffs, in the 29 games he's played in the postseason, he does have a .924 save percentage and a 2.06 goals against average, which both are very good career stats, even if he's had some mixed results game to game. Plus, with the obvious standout of the fact that the only season for the Blues that amounted to much in the playoffs when they won the Stanley Cup, he only played in one game and didn't play for very long in it. Really, the biggest question of Allen is whether or not he can hold up long-term as a starting goaltender, as the last 2 seasons that he saw significant starting time in St. Louis were statistically his 2 worst years. But they did also come off of 2 seasons with a similar amount of starts that were 2 of his better seasons, so it's a bit of a mixed bag, and time will only tell if he gets another chance. So in the end, when it comes to the Montreal Canadiens and the expansion draft, I also tend to fall into that camp of people that think that Josh Allen is probably the most likely pick here. I think he could serve very well as a 1A type of goalie in a platoon scenario, or even a pretty decent starter, given that the Kraken have a chance to have a very strong defensive team in front of him. Of course, I also wouldn't be mad at the pick of Armia if he were to see an extension before the expansion draft and be exposed for the Kraken to pick, and Chiarot also could serve as a good defenseman as part of that defensive core, or even a trade chip to get better forwards down the road. Of course, though, there is that one other scenario in which the Canadiens try to make a trade with the Kraken in order to keep their core together, and in this case, more importantly, their 2 goalie tandem of Price and Allen together in order to make some Stanley Cup runs in the next few years. And when it comes to what they could offer the Kraken in return for keeping their goalie tandem the way it is, there is always prospects, but with the Canadiens in particular, they have quite a number of draft picks that they could also offer up as trade bait. Because not only do they have all 7 of their picks in the next 2 drafts after this year, but in this year's draft, they have a pick in every round, and on top of that, 2 picks in the second round, 2 picks in the third round, and 3 picks in the fourth round. Which definitely for them would offer quite a bit of flexibility when it comes to offering the Kraken some picks and still having enough to use on their own. And of course, with this year's draft in particular being a bit of a wild card where it's probably better to have more picks later on than few picks early on in the draft, this is definitely a good position for Montreal to find themselves in. With that said though, we have reached the end of this one, so if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there's buttons for that kind of stuff down below. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Canadiens, what trades could happen, and whether or not you think someone other than Josh Allen should be the pick here. Otherwise, stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace.